So the last several weeks we've been talking about the power of the cross. And next week we're going to finish up this series, The Power of the Cross, as we celebrate Easter, because I think the greatest power of all of this story is found in the celebration of an empty tomb. And so we're going to celebrate that next week. If you've never been here, we have a great day planned. We would love for you to invite your friends and neighbors to come join us. There will be a lot of people here. And so if you can get here early and really sit down front and move in, that would be really helpful. But it's going to be a great day. We're really excited and ready for that day. Then the following week, we're going to start a new series called This Is Only a Test. We're going to talk a lot about testing in the Bible and what it looks like when we go through tests and trials in our life. And so I think this is a great series for you to invite a friend. Invite a friend to join us for Easter. Invite a friend to come back and join us the next week as we begin this new series, This Is Only a Test. So today, just kind of catch you up. Last week, we talked about this Exodus moment where the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt, and God heard their cry, and He came down to rescue them, and He had them go through this process with Him of these plagues, these moments of God's judgment and God's righteousness, concluding with this final moment where He tells them to take the blood of a lamb, to put it on the doorpost of their homes, and their only hope was that the blood of the lamb would keep them safe through the night. And of course, God does show mercy to His people, and He brings them out as slaves, and He leads them to the edge of the Red Sea, and He has Moses part the waters, and the people walk through the water on dry land, and their slave masters behind them are covered in the water. And so this is kind of the second major pattern we're looking at in this series. The first was the Day of Atonement and how the blood of the Lamb covers our sins. And then now this new paradigm of slavery and Exodus. As Paul and Peter and the other writers, even Jesus Himself, talk about sin as this slave master that has his grip on us. And so through this Exodus story last week, we said, through the Lamb, Yahweh rescues the Israelites from slavery to Pharaoh. And it was the blood of the Lamb on the doorpost of their home that redeemed them, that saved them, that kept them safe through the night. But here's the thing, it wasn't really the blood on the doorpost that kept them safe. It was God who kept them safe. The blood was a symbol that they belonged to Him, that they were a part of Him. And so He gives them a way to remember this moment, a way to look back and remember what He did for centuries to come. And He called it the Passover because it was the Passover that night where God passed through Egypt and He passed over the homes with blood on the doorposts. And He gave them this meal, this tangible way to celebrate and remember. And it's, why is this meal so important? Because it formed their identity as the people of God. It formed their identity. And so we're going to fast forward several thousand years to the very last week of Jesus' life. He comes into the city on what would have been the 10th day of Nicaea, a day when lambs from across the world really were being led into Jerusalem to be sacrificed. They were being led into the city, and Jesus comes in, and we have the triumphal entry as people are lining the streets. They are laying down palm branches, and they are shouting at the top of their lungs, "Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest." Josephus, a historian, says on this time every year, as people were coming into the city, there's one account from 66 AD where he says there were around 2.5 million Jews that would have come to the city, and probably around 250,000 lambs that would have been sacrificed. So think about this, 250,000 lambs being led into the city. Is Jesus riding on a donkey, hearing these words, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest, comes in to the city. Jesus is anointed at the home of Simon the leper. A lady breaks this alabaster jar of perfume and anoints him. And he says, this was for my burial. And he is coming in to the city. So I want to pick up in Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 14. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and asked, What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you? So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. And from then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So he makes this deal with the chief priests. And the chief priests are probably, for the most part, pretty good guys. Like, these are upstanding men in their community. They're probably the people you would want your kids hanging out with. Right? These are noble men. But they think what Jesus is doing is wrong and has to be stopped. And they offer him 30 pieces of silver. Now, if you're like me, that's just one of those things that's there and we don't really know exactly. 30 pieces of silver was probably about 120 days' wage. And so just kind of doing some really quick math, if you do like $7.25, which is I think what our minimum wage is, now I Googled that, $7.25, and you multiply it times 8-hour days, it's about $7,000. Okay? So it's a significant amount of money, but it's not a significant amount of money. You know what I mean? Like, that's a good bit of money, but at the same time, that's not setting you up for the rest of your life. It's not taking care of you for the next several years. It's enough. And so Judas agrees to betray Jesus for basically a couple of extra bucks. And then it says, on the first day of the festival of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus. Where do you want us to make preparations for the Passover? He replied, Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house. So the disciples did as Jesus directed them, and they prepared the Passover, which to me is kind of like the most CIA moment in the Bible. Right? Go into the city, find a certain man, tell him the teacher is going to take the Passover. It's kind of strange language. It's not real specific. So they go and they do this. They make preparations for the Passover. What is the Passover? Remember, we kind of looked at this last week with the blood of the Lamb. It's in Exodus chapter 12, where he says, Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must go slaughter them at twilight. Then they are going to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of their houses where they eat the lambs. So Jesus has been at the center of controversy. He's turned over the table in the temple. He's challenged the religious leaders. And they've been looking for a way to kill him and to betray him. And now he is walking back into the city one final time. Walking back into the city under the cover of darkness. And it appears that darkness will win the day. And so Matthew 26, verse 20. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And so this meal was celebrated every year to remember this day. And it was done with a family, your family, that would join you. And so I asked two of my family, I didn't invite all of them, the two most mobile that can sit on the floor with me. Ryan, sit over here, and Grace, you can sit here. And so they sat at this table, and the purpose of sitting here was to eat this meal, and the purpose of the meal was to remember. Why do you need to remember? So that you don't forget. Right? I mean, it seems pretty obvious. We need to remember so that we don't forget. And so year after year, this sacred meal was taken. And the purpose of this sacred meal was to tell Israel's story in a really tangible way that they could remember. And so we're going to kind of do really bare bones of a Seder meal. Much of what's done in a traditional Seder meal has just been added through the centuries, a lot of it really early on. But it was added to tell Israel's story with a lot of symbolism. But you've heard of the Rabbi Gamaliel. He was a teacher of someone pretty important in the Bible, Saul of Tarsus. And he said for Passover to take place, there are three things that have to happen. In Hebrew, Pesach, Matzah, and Ma'or. The Passover lamb, the matzah, the bread, the unleavened bread, and then the bitter herbs. Those are the three things that we read in Exodus. Okay? But with all good Jewish feasts, one of the things that you would have is good wine. And so I made some really good wine. Did you know in Hebrew, Peri Hagafen means fruit of the vine? It's actually translated as Welch's. And so with this meal, they would celebrate with this fruit of the vine. And they would speak this blessing: "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine." And it is a way, as I said, to remember. But then Jesus kind of kills the mood. Okay? Verse 21. And while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were all very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." Now, the irony of it is, who is going to betray him? Who's going to leave him? Who's going to abandon him? What's fixing to happen in the garden? All of them. In some form or fashion, all of them are fixing to walk away. All of them are fixing to abandon him. But there's one who we read about who's agreed to hand Jesus over. And so Jesus is eating this traditional Passover meal, and he's eating this Passover meal a little earlier than normal. And we'll get there in a few moments. But one of the first things that is done, I'll ask you to take a piece of lettuce, is the kirpas. And the karpas is typically a green vegetable that is dipped into salt water. And remember, the purpose of this is to tell a story. And you can think, okay, well, why is the karpas and why are they eating the salt water? There are a lot of different ideas and thoughts behind why they would eat the karpas. Probably the most popular one, the one I've heard the most, is that it goes back to the time of a guy named Joseph. If you remember Joseph, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. And once they sold him into slavery, they took his coat, right? They took his coat and they dipped it into blood, and they took it back to his father and said, your son Joseph has been killed by a wild beast. Right? This dipping symbolizes the time when Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, where they turned their back on him. And so Jesus says, the one who has dipped his hand into this bowl with me will betray me. Now, we don't know 100% if it was during the karpas, but it seems pretty logical with where it happens in this story. Is Jesus pointing ahead to what's fixing to happen with his brothers as they're fixing to betray him for a little bit of money and turn their back? And the Son of Man, verse 24, the Son of Man will go just as is written about him. But woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he was not born. Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, surely you don't mean me, Rabbi. Jesus answered, you have said so. And now at this point of the meal, what typically happens is the youngest child seated at the table will ask a series of questions, 4 questions, because remember, this is about telling the story of Israel so that we remember what our people have been through, what they have gone through. And it really is based off one question, but there are 4 questions that follow. And the question is, why is this night different from all other nights? And the 4 questions that go with it are, on all other nights we eat either bread or matzah. On this night, why only matzah? On all other nights we eat herbs and vegetables of any kind. On this night, why bitter herbs? On all other nights we do not dip even once. On this night we dip twice. On all other nights we eat our meals in any manner. On this night, why do we eat so, reclining around the table together, or sitting around the table together in a reclining position? And all of those are part of this meal, to answer these questions. Why matzah? Because when they were leaving Egypt, they didn't have time to allow for the bread to rise. They were told to make this unleavened bread, because when you put yeast into bread, right, you have to wait for it to rise. And they didn't have time. They were supposed to eat this in haste because they were going to be leaving at some point in the middle of that night. And so they were to eat this in haste. Why the bitter herbs? Because it reminds them of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. Why do we dip? We talked a little bit about. And then why do we recline? Because on that night they were slaves. On that night they ate in haste. But on this night, as they celebrate and they remember, now they are free. Now they are to recline and to eat like kings, eat like royalty, because they have been set free from slavery. And so constantly through this meal, there are all these different aspects that tell the story of the people of Israel and their release from captivity, from bondage. Right? That was the purpose of the questions. And so at this point of the meal, by the way, a typical Seder meal is about 2 hours long. I have been your best friend today, and I've really condensed it to the main parts, so it'll only be an hour and a half. No, not really. But the next part of this would be the reading of the beginning of Exodus that tells the story of the people of Israel being led out of Egypt and out of slavery. But instead of doing that, because it takes probably about 45 minutes in a ceremony, I'm going to read from Deuteronomy 26. My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And this is the story that they remember. God's goodness and mercy for His people. And how did He do that? He did it with these 10 plagues. These 10 plagues that were these moments of justice, these times where it seemed like Pharaoh had a chance to say, okay, yeah, we're gonna let up, we're gonna stop. Right? But Pharaoh, as we talked about last week, was stubborn. And his heart won. And God let his heart win. And it led to the destruction of the people of Egypt. But this last plague was the plague of the firstborn, where God says, if you'll put the blood on the doorpost, I'm going to pass through, and I will pass over your house, and you will be spared. Now, if you remember how the Exodus story begins, it actually begins with Pharaoh killing all of the baby boys 2 years old and under, thrown into the Nile River. Here, God gives them an opportunity, a way out of that punishment. He gives them a way out if they will just choose to take it. You see, this is a liberation story of how God saves us. Continuing on, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when He had given thanks, He broke it, and He gave it to His disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." So He took this bread, He broke it, and He blessed it. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings bread from the earth. I made this last night. My first time to make matzah. Pretty good, isn't it? And if you remember this story, as Jesus is doing this, what's fixing to happen to Jesus? He's fixing to be beaten, broken, and whipped, sacrificing His life. And so He says to these disciples, "This is my body. It was broken for you. Take and eat," as a way to remember. And then there was another aspect of this meal. These bitter herbs. My kids have never had the bitter herbs. Can I have your plate? And what you would do, just a little bit will be plenty. You take the matzah and you dip it in the bitter herbs. Kind of got to commit to this, okay? This is We'll be back in just a second. You have Welch's. And the point of it was it is supposed to be bitter. It's supposed to bring tears to your eyes a little bit. Y'all good? Aren't y'all glad you're in my family? You think, okay, well, why the bitter herbs? Exodus tells us, so they put slave masters over them and oppressed them with forced labor. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. And harsh labor for the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. Right? And this eating of the ma'or was a way to participate in the story. It was a way to remember God's goodness at a time when life was not good. That God still heard the cry of His people. And He loved them enough to come down. Then He took a cup, and when He had given thanks, He gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of my covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates fruit from the vine." See, Jesus' death on the cross wasn't just a symbol of confronting the evil slave master. It was quite literally taking on all the evil the world could produce. Not figuratively, but literally. Taking it upon Himself. See, Jesus very rarely speaks about the reason behind His death and why He has to die. But one time He does, earlier in the book of Matthew, He says that I came to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. I came to take the place, to pay the price, the enormous cost of sin by taking it upon Himself. Jesus knows what's fixing to happen over the next 12 hours. He knows what the road He is fixing to walk leads to. That it leads them outside of the city, up on a hill. Killed under the weight of sin. And He tells His disciples, I tell you that I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. Thank y'all. Y'all can go. Y'all want bitter herbs to take with you? But there's something that's missing from this meal. And it's the lamb. Now, the gospel writers could have all omitted it. They didn't mention the bitter herbs. I'm sure they had bitter herbs in this Passover meal. The gospel writers could have just decided the lamb is so crucial to this meal, we're not even going to bother to mention it. Or they didn't have lamb. See, I choose to believe that they actually don't have a lamb at this meal. Because when they are eating this Passover is actually a little bit early. They're eating it because days and nights were kind of flipped from what we think of the beginning of a day. We think of the beginning of the day when the sun rises. They thought of the end of the day as when the sun set. And so the next day would begin that evening as darkness fell. And so for the people of Jerusalem, as they brought the lambs into the city, the lambs actually wouldn't be killed till twilight the following day. And as Jesus sits around the table with his disciples, it seems like the lamb is absent. But the reality is the lamb is right there. But as for the rest of the city, the lamb won't be sacrificed until twilight the following day. When Jesus, hanging on a cross, breathes his last breath. And the lamb was inspected, just as he was supposed to be. Inspected by Herod, inspected by Pilate, and they found no reason that he should be accused of his crimes. And it's fascinating that Jesus doesn't write down this story for us. Instead, he gives us a meal that we already had, but yet he transforms the meaning of it, the way that we are to think about it. And for the early writers of the New Testament, that's how they thought of this moment and what Jesus did. It tells us in Corinthians that Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Peter says, "For you know that it was not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you by our ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect." Right? Through the lamb, Yahweh rescues the Israelites from slavery to Pharaoh, retelling Israel's story of people being rescued from slavery. And ultimately, through Jesus, Yahweh rescues the world from slavery to sin and death. But Jesus didn't just come for Israel. He came for the whole world. Right? Jesus welcomed and invited the 12, a ragtag group of misfits that no one else would have chosen. He called a Roman soldier his enemy, a tax collector, Pharisees. He called the sick, he called the healthy. He called the religious and he called the irreligious. He called the Israelites and he called the non-Israelites. And he said, "Come, follow me, and be a part of my kingdom. Be a part of my new world. Be a part of my body that was broken for you. Be a part of my blood that was poured out for you, for the forgiveness of sins." Because this meal isn't just a meal remembering what it was like to be slaves in Egypt. He transformed it into this moment where sin and death were defeated. And this meal that now represents what He did on the cross to set us free from our slave masters.